You know what she was saying.
Podcasts are getting way too out of hand. Why does Home Depot, Heinz Ketchup, and your mom all need their own podcasts? Seriously, think of any brand, minor celebrity, or niche topic, and they'll probably have a podcast about it. Who is listening to these? And when will the podcast bubble burst?
Holy f***, you got a podcast too?
Podcasts emerged from humble beginnings and later evolved into groundbreaking, award-winning shows. Recently, however, the sheer variety of podcasts with drastic levels of quality has left many overwhelmed. It seems for every Joe Rogan, there are 100,000 average Joes trying to do the same thing. Although competition has never been steeper, the majority of podcasts are still, quite frankly, terrible.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. You guys aren't huge talkers, so I don't think a podcast is in the future. I mean, if we're being honest, so.
Currently, there are over 4 million podcasts worldwide. However, only around 17% of them are considered active. Most start out with tremendous enthusiasm, but eventually quit after failing to gain listeners or being able to maintain a routine.
There's only so many times that I can talk about the same thing.
It's not just podcast hosts becoming exhausted by the medium, but the listeners too, with this phenomenon now coined as pod fade. For every interesting new podcast that can be found, it seems you'll have to sift through dozens of short-lived, low-effort shows being released from every friend, relative, and coworker who thinks their mediocre conversation is set to be the next serial.
Hey, you know what, guys? This right here, this rambling, boring conversation containing already made-before observations, this could be a podcast.
So why is everyone continuing to hop on the podcast bandwagon? Well, money, obviously. It's hard to ignore that top podcasts are receiving 7 figures in annual advertising revenue, and some are also being bought up by Spotify for multi-million-dollar exclusive deals. You can find hundreds, if not thousands of books, courses, and even other podcasts dedicated to starting your own podcast purely for the intent of making money. Like most other get-rich-quick schemes, the belief is that podcasts can earn big bucks but require a much lower level of effort compared to the relative difficulty of producing other forms of scripted content. Whether that be countless rewatch podcasts from washed-up actors on shows that ended decades ago, or mediocre MMA fighters attempting comedy, there is no shortage of discussions that have little need for it to be recorded. Alright, that's a bit harsh. Some of these shows are genuinely entertaining, but in order to find the odd good one, you're going to have to sift through a minefield of garbage.
It's worth it.
What's a bottled water that's really good you recommend?
You can do Mountain Valley spring water. You can do Avian.
Evian. I love Evian.
Yeah, those are good ones.
Tastes good.
Fiji? No.
It's okay.
You see, I wouldn't have known that. I would not have known that, and this is very educational for me.
Oh, that's awesome.
It does seem baffling why someone would bother making a podcast in the first place if they never intend on putting in any serious effort. It seems like Let's Start a Podcast has become this generation's version of Let's Start a Band, a sort of half-baked plan that seems like a good idea at the time. However, what many creators have discovered is that if they have already built an audience elsewhere, they can often easily attract many of their most loyal fans to consume their podcasts as well. No matter how garbage the podcast content might be, some fans will remain fiercely obsessed. Like, honestly, do we really need Kim Kardashian to host a true crime podcast? Okay, sure. Money, low-effort production, and loyal transferable audiences are key reasons as to why low-quality podcasts have sprung up over the last few years, but there's another, even bigger reason for why podcasts remain such an attractive and effective medium. Authority. For both the host and the guest, by the nature of having mic'd up, long-winded recorded discussions, they can often innately persuade the listener to believe that they are listening to someone that deserves to be listened to. Podcasts are basically like the new TED Talk for younger viewers. Well, actually, they're more like TEDx. While TED Talks are exclusive events where people pay over $10,000 to hear the lecture, TEDx is like their pathetic brother that allows basically anyone to host a lecture, yet for some reason still tries to demand the same level of respect as an actual TED Talk.
I have absolutely nothing to say whatsoever. And yet, through my manner of speaking, I will make it seem like I do. Like what I am saying is brilliant. And maybe, just maybe, you will feel like you've learned something.
Today, there are far too many shows with overconfident podcast hosts and guests. As a casual listener, it's sometimes hard to determine if they're actually knowledgeable or completely full of it. At the very least, podcasts have certainly emerged as one of the best places for a new wave of experts to shine. Take YouTuber/podcaster Derek from More Plates, More Dates. Although Derek is incredibly knowledgeable about performance-enhancing drugs and their effects on the human body, his education comes from his own personal use and his extraordinary depth of research. Despite this, traditionally, he would not be seen as a credible expert as he isn't a medical doctor. However, Derek is arguably more knowledgeable about the subject matter than many conventional doctors. His extensive analysis and entertaining personality has cultivated into a large audience, solidifying his status as someone worth listening to. He's a positive example of this new wave of experts, but this isn't always the case.
If you're a guy in your 20s and you don't have a Lamborghini, you should actually sit down and have like a serious discussion with yourself as to why you don't have a Lambo.
How can 1 times 1 equaling 1 be part of the multiplication table?
Are you a beta male?
I don't think so.
Beta!
That's why women shouldn't vote, because they don't want to do the infrastructure jobs. They don't want to be net taxpayers, and they want to take money from men through divorce and alimony. And I think if you're going to do that, most women do, I think you should not be able to vote yes.
I'm sorry, what?
Even worse than spewing nonsense, if you spend enough time on TikTok, you'll start to notice that many podcast clips are faked, attempting to capitalize on the same artificial sense of authority for personal gain. Financial gurus, wannabe entrepreneurs, pickup artists, and small-time influencers are the most common groups using this video technique to pretend like their opinions hold more weight than they should. Most can agree that some of the biggest podcasts like Armchair Expert and the Joe Rogan Experience thrive not because the hosts themselves are exceptionally captivating, but because they often bring on guests that are incredibly interesting. Gary Vee discusses this unique feature of podcasts with the analogy of the high school party rule.
I want to take you back to high school. Now think about sophomore, junior, senior year, and think very carefully about that one kid who wasn't the most popular kid in school, but had the great fortune that his parents weren't around on weekends. That kid, as a mid-level popular kid, had the great idea of being the person that threw the party so the popular kids could come and hook up and drink. That kid's popularity exploded over the next year or two. The person that hosts the party has the leverage.
These podcast hosts weren't popular on their own, but by riding on the backs of popular people, they too climbed their way to the top. As their podcast continues to grow, they seek out broader audiences through an array of guests, yet as the host, they still keep the authority. Large corporations have also caught notice of this, and many have launched their own podcasts, designed to be a place where like-minded people can discuss relevant topics, but in a carefully curated environment where the corporation controls the narrative. These podcasts have many goals, like convincing others they should work there, attempting to remain hip with the younger audiences, or delicately pushing listeners towards the products and services that they offer. While the podcast style of interviewing experts and famous people have emerged as the most popular format for now, it's clearly a crutch for podcast hosts as it requires little of the hosts themselves. It's starting to seem pretty annoying seeing the same routine experts bounce from podcast to podcast. Like, why is this same former CIA spy going on so many different podcasts? Who knows? Maybe it's an elaborate psyop. Many of these routine expert guests are also starting to launch their own podcasts instead, which in time will likely fragment their audience. For example, many listen to Joe Rogan for his health-related episodes where he interviews guests such as neuroscientist Andrew Huberman. After gaining his own popularity due to his guest appearances, the Huberman Lab podcast was launched, likely cannibalizing many of Joe Rogan's health-focused listeners. The major podcasters today have become akin to the TV talk shows that were supposedly their corporate predecessors. These shows now routinely interview A-list celebrities that are clearly on a promotional tour, hopping from one podcast to another, saying many of the same things. It is a natural evolution that as the show gets bigger, they should go after broader audiences, But many feel that the authenticity of their favorite podcasts has been left behind in exchange for growth and money. The wildly successful show Call Her Daddy began with raunchy yet sincere conversations amongst two friends. Fast forward to a $60 million Spotify deal and their friendship already destroyed over money disputes, the show has now just become another vehicle to interview famous people. It appears as this is the ultimate end goal for every aspiring podcaster, but once they get to that point, the show loses much of its original niche appeal. Celebrities have become their new marketing tool, and with platforms like YouTube becoming an emerging home for podcasts, chasing views is all that matters. Today, YouTube has become infested with podcasts. Although clickbait thumbnails including celebs certainly help, their infestation makes more sense when you consider YouTube's algorithm is designed to promote the videos that have the highest level of average watch time and engagement. In a way, podcasts kind of abuse YouTube's algorithm. Most podcast videos are multi-hour recordings of a conversation, and the people consuming the podcast videos are often doing it passively. Listeners are likely driving somewhere or folding their laundry. While distracted with other activities, naturally the watch time in these videos will be significantly higher than a video that requires your full attention. YouTube, well aware of this, is now working on better ways that they can segregate podcasts from their other video content, as many YouTube suggestions have become littered with podcasts.
I did a podcast one time with Colin and Samir, which they averaged a couple 100,000 views a video, but that podcast got 12 million views because on average, people listen to that podcast for 45 minutes. And It was only an hour and 20 podcast. So because YouTube could see people were watching it for so long, that's a great indicator that they loved it.
Eventually, this podcast bubble will burst, where only loyalty to the host or a catalog of overused guests won't be enough to support their low-effort conversations. When this podcast bubble will burst is hard to pinpoint, but arguably, it's already started to happen. Podcast burnout has driven innovative creators to instead produce unique shows that challenge what a podcast is and what it should be. Much in the same way YouTube went from a mere file-sharing service to quirky sketches to professional content today that rivals that of Hollywood studios, this is the natural evolution of the platform and the content itself. Will the quirky, admittedly low-effort podcasts you enjoy today still exist in the future? Some will, but most won't. Eventually, we will all expect more from podcasts and even more from ourselves.